Good afternoon and welcome to the Fall 2020 Common Hour event. My name is Mary Pat McMahon and I'm Duke's Vice Provost, Vice President of Student Affairs.
And I'm Gary Bennett, Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education.
We are here to introduce our MBA Commissioner, Adam Silver, and also to tell you a little bit about the generation of this Common Hour program and how we're getting to take it live on a live stream today.
So Common Hour is a program that was created by the Duke Student Government's Academic Affairs Committee back in 2018, along with our office, the Office of Undergraduate Education. And our goal is to try to bring the Duke community, students, faculty, staff, parents and alums, all of us together for a shared experience, a common hour, when we get to hear somewhat informally from a prominent speaker who's a member of the Duke community. So our past guests have included everyone from Vincent Price, our current president, Mary Klopman, the dean of the medical school, Ravi Bellamkonda, the dean of our School of Engineering, and John Blackshear, our new dean of students.
Typically, the Common Hour was limited to about 150 students and undergraduates on campus, and the idea had been that we'd have it over a meal and in a smaller venue. In the COVID times, we've actually had an opportunity to expand this event to the entire Duke community. It's a silver lining of the pandemic, and all the stakeholders that Gary mentioned earlier now get to be involved in part of our program today. We're so happy that you're here. We also want to thank our Duke student government leaders for a couple of things. They've been tireless in their advocacy on behalf of students and in their partnership with us and our offices and other leaders at Duke as we've all adapted to this pandemic times. Particularly, we want to say thank you to Tommy Hessel, DSG president, and Trey Majidar, the DSG vice president for academic affairs.
So it's our great pleasure to introduce this fall's featured guest, Adam Silver, Trinity College class of 1984, commissioner of the MBA, Duke trustee, and someone that Mary Pat and I are very proud to call a colleague and a friend. Adam presides over global sports and media business that's built around 4 professional sports leagues, the NBA, the WNBA, the NBA G League, and the NBA 2K League. He's dedicated to growing basketball around the world, embracing innovation and new technologies, increasing transparency, and using basketball to bring people together to promote health and fitness.
Over the past few years, Adam has been named Sports Business Journal's Executive of the Decade and ranked #1 on that publication's annual list of the 50 most influential people in sports business. He's also been named one of Time's 100 most influential people, Fortune's World 50 Greatest Leaders, and the Bloomberg Businessweek 50. Following the NBA's extraordinary bubble season in which there were no transmissions of COVID inside the bubble, he's been hailed for his incredible leadership in pivoting and adapting with all that's happening in the pandemic and for his extraordinary leadership.
What you might not know about Adam, though, is that he serves with us as a trustee on our undergraduate education committee. And let me just tell you that as an alum, it is a great pleasure to have someone of his expertise and experience and stature working to support the transformative undergraduate experience that Duke aspires to create for all of our students.
Really been amazing. And Gary and I are also very excited to hand this moderation responsibility over to 2 amazing alumni, Josh Hairston, a Duke 2014 graduate, former co-captain of the men's basketball team, current venture capitalist and future NBA agent, as well as Jenna Fresh, a Duke 2015 grad, former co-captain of the women's basketball team, and current 4th year at Duke School of Medicine and 2nd year Master of Theological Studies students at Duke Divinity School. They've really stepped up to take this program into a broader format as well. And we're just so appreciative of both of them for their time.
Yeah, thank you both for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope you enjoy this chat with Adam.
Thank you both so much for that kind introduction. So hi, everyone. Before we kick this event off, one last important note. We want to make it clear this is not a press event. So should there be any members of the media in our audience tonight, this is a relatively casual, off-the-record fireside chat with Commissioner Silver, exclusively for the Duke community. So with that, let's get started with a rapid-fire opening. So Commissioner Silver, did you have a childhood nickname?
First of all, call me Adam, please, Jenna, and you too, Josh. And I just also want to thank Mary Pat and Gary for those really nice introductions. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone today. And all those great honors they mentioned in my bio, I owe them all to Duke. So thanks everyone in the community. Childhood nickname. when I was in elementary school, I had a teacher that started calling me AG. And Jenna, because you are, of course, are a med student, you understand that that's the element for symbol for silver. So then I don't think even a lot of my little elementary school friends understood what it meant, but people were calling me AG for a long time.
Special one.
Adam, thank you again for joining us today. My question for you is, what are 1 or 2 quirks or pet peeves of yours?
One that I think my colleagues all think is really odd, but I'm really insistent that people put a date on every document. I think it was from my early days as a lawyer when I used to, they call it discovery in a lawsuit when you're looking at old documents. And it always used to drive me crazy when you couldn't figure out when a document was from and you had to decipher it from just what people were saying. And even in my own notes I make to myself, I'm always very careful to put a date on it because it just drives me crazy, especially people out there, you know, or students too, who do multiple drafts of documents. When they don't have dates on them, it always confuses me. So I'm very insistent that people date everything.
All right, who is your favorite superhero, either fictional or in real life?
Well, there's one, and it's a slightly serious one because he crosses over from real life to fiction, and that's the Black Panther and Chadwick Boseman. You all probably know he died at a young age recently, but he was someone who I got to know really well through the NBA. He was a big fan. He did some things with us at an All-Star game, and we had just become friends over the years. So he was definitely my hero, both in real life and sort of fictionally too, as Black Panther.
Yeah, his passing, I think, shocked all of us. That was a really sad day for all of us.
I have a voicemail from him on my phone from like about 3 weeks before he died that I'm always going to save.
Amazing. It's amazing. What is one thing that you have always wanted to do?
I don't know. I wish I could say climb Mount Everest. I mean, I'm so fortunate, to be honest. I mean, I'm in a job that I could have never have dreamed of, and I'm fortunate to be in it. I have to think about that one. Maybe I'll come back. I don't have an easy answer on that. I wish I'll say one thing. Jen, as you start off on your career into medicine, I mean, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a doctor, but I didn't think I had it in me. Like I was never great at the sciences, I made that decision at a very young age, so who knows? But I didn't think I had the aptitude for it. But I'm jealous of people in the sciences, and like especially as we've been going through COVID, and I've gotten to talk on a regular basis to a lot of renowned experts. I'm so fascinated, and to me, just the logic of it, the science of it, the analytics and data. I think, Josh, it's one of the things in Jenna that attracted me to sports in a way, because there's a beginning and an end. There's a clear winner. And so, I wish I could have been a scientist.
There's still time.
Okay.
All right. How many hours of sleep do you get on average?
It's one of those things where, because I wish I got a lot more, and I'm not one of those advocates of people who say that that you should brag about how little you sleep, because I wish I slept more. So my answer is not enough.
Never enough. Okay, so this next one, you gotta be truthful, Adam. Scale of 1 to 10, how good of a driver are you?
I actually think I'm a pretty good driver. I think that's one of those questions though, where if you asked people if they thought they were above average driver, like 90% of people would define themselves as above average. I would rate myself. I did a lot of driving when I was younger. Like when I was at Duke, my parents were divorced, but both went back and forth from New York to Florida. And so they both had me drive their cars back and forth every year. So it's like 4 trips from Florida to New York. And I was like really proud of my driving ability. I drove obviously back and forth from Duke a lot, and then to Chicago when I was in law school there. I will say that I've slowed down a lot as I've gotten older. And now my wife makes fun of me because if the speed limit's 30, I drive like 32 or 33. And and people are like blinking their brights behind me and stuff. So I've become a more careful driver, that's for sure.
Safe driver. I respect that.
All right. What is one thing that you still have from your childhood?
Anxiety.
Texting or talking?
Sorry?
Texting or talking?
Texting. I like talking on the phone casually, but I love texting. I wish I had invented it when I was younger. The idea too, instead of trading calls all day, you can, it's not a substitute obviously for talking to people, but I'm a big texter.
What's your guilty pleasure?
I think really bad movies late at night, and the kind where, your generation, where it's mainly over the top services like Netflix and Amazon, where you're picking what you want to watch. I'm more from the generation of late night cable, where you just went to HBO, whenever it was on at 1 o'clock in the morning, you watched. So I've watched multiple times a lot of really bad movies late at night.
And last one, Adam, most humbling moment you can remember.
I'm not going to tell well, I'll say one also to two former Duke basketball players. When I was a freshman, so I started at Duke in 1980, fall of 1980, right when Coach K began. And so unbelievable, 40 years ago. And at the very first preseason game of the season in Cameron, so it would have been Coach K's first game at Cameron Indoor, I went down the student section and nobody was sleeping outside in those days before games. So just went in with my student ID, and I was sitting a few rows behind the basket with a group of friends that I just met. And they had a random contest at halftime for shooting a free throw. And my name was called. And I was so scared, I was pretending my name wasn't called. And like some guy next to me says, "Isn't your name Adam Silver?" And I was like, "Well, I don't hear it." And he's like, "Get out there." And I will say, and this is where I set a very low bar. I knew there was very little chance I was going to make the basket. And I was thinking, I just got to hit something, And so I hit the front of the rim, but it was very humbling. It was nerve-wracking, humbling. And to me, that was an accomplishment at the time, that I'd just hit iron, that the ball that I didn't totally throw an air ball, but it was pretty humbling in that moment in my life.
I understand. My first experience in Cameron as a player was very similar. I remember the first practice, my shots were all short, and I just remember how humbling it was being in that atmosphere. So I totally understand.
And you were there to play basketball. Think of me.
What? I was there to play. Adam, again, thank you so much for joining us today. That was just the rapid fire questions. I'd like to transition into the bulk of the conversation, but I'd like to start off by asking you this one question first. 2020 has been a year of the unthinkable for so many of us. And to start off 2020, we lost the great legendary Kobe Bryant. And I'd like to ask you about Kobe and his legacy. I'd like to also ask you about his impact on the league, the players that watched him, because I can speak for myself and my generation. Kobe Bryant was our Michael Jordan. And so not only was it a loss to the basketball community, but the sports community and the world as a whole. And so I'd like to ask you about Kobe Bryant. I'd like to ask you about his impact on the league and how you guys plan to continue his legacy and honor him throughout the course of these next seasons.
Sure. And I'll just add, just because your question began, we started off 2020, and actually on the very first day of this year, David Stern passed. Somebody that I had worked directly for almost 22 years before I became commissioner, and someone who not only was a mentor, but became one of my closest friends. So I always, when I think of this year, then Kobe, then COVID, and other issues, frankly, that happened last season, so it begins with David. And I would just say, he was such an important figure in my life. And then when when Kobe passed, again, he and his daughter Gianna and their friends, I mean, obviously, you know, it was a tragic accident, and the guy who was sort of just beginning the next chapter of his life. I mean, not only was one of the NBA greatest, to your point, Michael Jordan of his generation, but so multifaceted, you know, and he and I earlier last year, almost around this time, maybe a month earlier, we were in China together for what was the World Championships of basketball, which were in Beijing, and we'd spent a few days there together. And we had a chance to have a few meals together, and we were talking a lot about sort of his plans, where he'd already won an Academy Award for a short, as unbelievable as that was, but he was getting into filmmaking. He was writing a book. He had his basketball academy. You know, he was assisting the Lakers. And I remember I was taken by his level of engagement, his enthusiasm, his curiosity. I remember he was, you know, because of his daughter Gianna was, you know, a top player in her age bracket, he was fascinated, and Jenna, not just directing this to you, but to everybody, with WNBA and what was happening in women's basketball. In fact, I remember when we were together at dinner in Beijing, I was telling him about Kathy Engelbert, who came on as the new commissioner of the WNBA. And he was saying, I got to come meet with her. You know, I want to talk about some opportunities. I have some thoughts. And I said, great, you know, here's her number, call her. I'll tell her, expect your call. And I remember when I got back to my room late that night, which was morning New York time, I called Kathy and I said, look, I started explaining. She's like, oh no, he already called me. I mean, that was Kobe. It was like the here and now. So, you know, it was a shock to the system, no doubt, for everyone in the NBA, including, because to your point, Josh, like, you're the age of obviously a lot of our players, a lot of them, some are a little bit older than you, but so many of them just worshiped him as a player. And he stayed really close to a lot of the guys in the league. I mean, because he was in the league, you know, 20 years, that a lot of them had played with him, of course. And he was the kind of guy who would just reach out, call player, tips, whatever else. So, you know, it was devastating. To your point about honoring him, I think, as you know, we changed the MVP award, because then we went on to the All-Star game in Chicago in February. And so we changed the All-Star MVP award to the Kobe Bryant MVP award. And I'm sure we will find other ways to honor him, and frankly, for David Stern too. I think then shortly after, obviously, the pandemic set in, and we, you know, haven't had a chance, you know, in the same way to come together as a community to think about other opportunities. But I'm sure there will be. And again, the hardest part for me is that, I mean, as accomplished as he was as a basketball player, I'm absolutely convinced there's more he would have done, even beyond that Hall of Fame, 18-time All-Star, you know, multiple championship career off the floor. I mean, because he was just such a curious and engaged person. And talk about your sleep question. I mean, he literally, I mean, like, you know, and I was sort of saying to him, I was like, you're not so young anymore. I mean, like, he literally like would sleep a few hours. Like, he was, you know, he was the player who would have the 5 a.m. practices. But just like Michael Jordan, incidentally, that wasn't and going to bed at 9 o'clock at night. That was, you know, burning the candle at both ends. I mean, and again, I'm not suggesting it to especially young people, you know, watching this. Some people just have that unique ability, but just a remarkable person in every way.
Definitely. He was for sure a unique individual. And I, of course, can't forget Commissioner Stern. He ushered in the league to a new phase of global dominance that obviously that we have now. And so definitely that was another tragic loss for not only the basketball community, but the sports community. So thank you for that, Commissioner. I'd like to transition. Adam, I'm sorry, Adam. I'd like to transition.
The Duke family.
Yeah, it is. I'm sorry. You know, I'm from the South, and so I just, you know, that's just how I am. Adam, I'd like to transition into the pandemic, COVID-19, and the bubble. So, when you and your team found out that Jazz center Rudy Gobert tested positive for COVID-19 hours before the Jazz were to play against Oklahoma City, what was going through your head? If you could walk the Duke community through what the decision-making process was like between then and suspending the season? And did you think that the restart would happen at all or as quickly as it did?
So we didn't find out hours before that game was supposed to tip. We found out minutes before that game was supposed to tip. And just so that was March 11th, the day we suspended the league's operations. But now just turning the clock back a couple months, we have a large presence in China, I think, as you guys know. And so beginning in January, I'm in regular touch, obviously, with my colleagues in our offices there. And so I was hearing a lot about the coronavirus, what was happening there, the shutdowns. People had started to work from home in mid-January. Whole cities were being closed down, Wuhan in particular. And in fact, if somebody goes back to All-Star, I think a lot of people didn't know what we were referring to, but because of the presence we have in China, a lot of our All-Stars on the telecasts were sending good wishes to their friends in Wuhan. It was sort of, I think at my All-Star press conference, I said something about, be safe to our colleagues and our friends, particularly in Wuhan. So we at the league were very focused on what was happening in China. Not to say we were predicting the impact it was going to have on the United States, but we were very aware of the virus. Then maybe coming out of All-Star out of mid-February, some of the people that we had worked with for a long time, some of those scientists, in fact, one in particular named David Ho, who when I first got to the league in the early 90s, he was somebody David Stern had brought on as an advisor on HIV and AIDS when of course, Magic was diagnosed. And he's someone he's at Columbia University. I kept in touch with him over the years. And we had run into each other in late January, in fact, at a Brooklyn Nets game where they were having a Chinese New Year celebration. And we were just making small talk. And I was saying, what do you think is going to happen with this virus? And again, he wasn't by any means predicting that it was going to become the pandemic. It did, but he said he was keeping a close watch on it and particularly impact it could have on the United States. So we were very aware of it. And then by late February, early March, our advisors were telling us that we should think about a protocol to begin testing players. And that's what takes me to Rudy Gobert. So when Rudy Gobert tested positive on March 11th, there wasn't a lot of testing going on. And he was not by any means the first player we had tested for COVID. Beginning maybe 2 weeks earlier, if a player had flu-like symptoms, if a player was running a high fever, we had put in place arrangements with all of our 30 teams so that they had a relationship with a lab. And they could, and this was before people were talking about a constraint of availability of testing. And I mean, we were talking about obviously very few tests. We were just talking about NBA players. So we had already begun thinking about this issue. So even before March 11th, we had had a discussion. I had a discussion with Michelle Roberts, who's my counterpart at the Players Association. She's the executive director, about whether we should, I think I was calling it a hiatus at the time, because there begun to be discussions, not about shutting down games, but potentially limiting fans that could come into arenas. And I said, maybe we should shut down for a while and think of what the health and safety protocols should be around fans. Again, it wasn't so much about testing at that moment, but whether we had to adopt different cleaning protocols, ventilation protocols, et cetera. And so we'd begun talking about it. And then I had scheduled a board meeting, so our NBA owners are referred to as the governor of the team. And so the governors all had a board meeting. It was telephonic on March 11th to discuss the fact that in some US cities, they were talking about limiting the number of fans. And just to be clear, and my recollection is, on that date, March 11th, not a single public health official, including Dr. Fauci for that matter, were recommending that we shut down. It was just a question in some cities, depending where the virus was picking up, whether we should reduce the number of fans. So we had had a board meeting that day, not to make any decisions necessarily, but to getting input. What were you hearing in your market? What's going on here? And my recollection is it wasn't an NBA market, but I think the first real constraint was in San Jose, California. The question was what was going to be the impact on San Francisco? So then right before tip that night, so it was that, as you said, Utah Jazz playing Oklahoma City. So the game was in Oklahoma City. And I got a call from the governor of that team, a guy named Clay Bennett. I think it was, within like 15 minutes before 8, like 7:15 New York time, 6:45 their time, saying, we just got this result back. Because the Oklahoma, even though it was a member of the Utah Jazz, the test had been administered through the Oklahoma City or Oklahoma State Public Health Authority. And we got the test. So I would say I had the benefit that I'd already been thinking about it a lot, and we've been thinking what we were going to do. And since we were already thinking that we might take some sort of hiatus to reconstruct sort of what our protocol should be, to me, I made the decision that moment to suspend operations. So it was, and again, I mean, I had other colleagues involved, but to answer the other part of your question about what I then thought, if you had asked me then, I would have said, we'll take a pause for 30 days and then we'll restart. We'll have some new protocols in place to help protect people. And nobody was talking about mask wearing at that point. Just are the things we can be doing in our arenas to protect people? And will there be some limits on attendance? So that's what I thought at that moment. Of course, things began sort of to snowball in the next few days, and multiple industries, other leagues all shut down. The NCAA did as well. And then I think in roughly, a few days later, at that point, it was pretty clear we weren't going to be reopening for a while. But again, if you look back then, there was so much that was unknown in mid-March, and I don't think anyone was really predicting quite what would happen, the extent of the lockdowns, because as my recollection, it took a while even before they declared this a pandemic. So that was at least my thinking then.
And as far as the restart, what was your priority for you? Was it obviously player safety and fan safety is always number one, but was there any thought that you were thinking, obviously I know you said the 30 days, but once you realized how severe it was, did you think the restart could happen?
I wasn't sure. I remember, at first I was doing regular media conferences, and, people kept asking me what date, what are the factors? And it was hard then to say, to be too specific about what the conditions are in which we thought we could reopen. Again, that same scientist I mentioned before, David Ho, and Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General, was advising us and also advising the NCAA, and a group of really distinguished academics and scientists were consulting with us. And I remember initially we made a decision, in essence, that we would make no decisions in April. I think we realized circumstances and events were changing so quickly that we needed to step back. We were looking at options. And I would say when the concept first came up of a so-called bubble, I didn't take it all that seriously. I didn't think it was realistic. And because initially too, we ended up calling it a campus. I mean, a name I'm sure I stole from Duke. But I mean, this notion of a bubble, initially, people had this sense that we'd be, for example, at a hotel in Las Vegas, and literally people wouldn't leave this hotel that was connected to an arena. I think as we started to look at the concept and look at different potential sites, Disney, of course, the owner of ESPN, is one of our strongest partners. And the CEO, or he's now stepped down as CEO, but he's I guess the chairman of the board, Bob Iger, someone I've known for a long time. In fact, his wife, Willow Bay, used to work at the NBA. So we were personal friends and business friends for a long time. And he and I, together with Chris Paul, who not only an NBA All-Star, but is the president of the Players Association, began to talk about this notion that maybe we could do something down in Orlando, Florida. And well, again, we call it a bubble for short. It was really more of a campus environment, opportunity for a golf course, lots of outdoor space, fishing. I mean, not that anybody would want to be confined that way over a long period of time, an enormous sacrifice that comes with it, but it began to seem realistic. to us that we could do it. And at the same time, by the way, the WNBA, we were looking similarly in Florida at the IMG Academy, which is in Bradenton, Florida, and also a similar campus type environment. But still, we weren't sure. And at that time, this goes back to the testing issue. I'm sure some people remember that even when we had, on one hand, they were praising us for shutting down because we had tested Rudy Gobert, figured out that he was COVID positive, and halted the league. But then when we did some additional testing of teams that had played the Utah Jazz in the last few days, there was enormous criticism that we were using needed tests. And I understood that. I mean, again, we're talking in retrospect about literally 50 tests, that we went on to do. But, we understood the public policy issue, and we didn't do much more testing after that for a period of time. And then the issue became, when we were going to reopen, we knew we were going to play inside some sort of bubble, both the NBA and the WNBA. Part of what was going to make it operational was the ability to test everyone in that environment on a daily basis. Now, again, in the scope of the millions and millions of tests that are now being administered on a weekly basis in the United States, it's thousands. But as a public health issue, as a public policy issue, it wasn't clear whether that would be acceptable for us to use those tests, or I should say appropriate, putting aside how others saw it. It then, when a lot of additional testing came online, we thought we could cross sort of that hurdle. And then the issue became for our players. Now, in retrospect, looking back, our two campuses may have been the safest places in the United States. And in all seriousness, I mean, we stood up 2 bubbles, multiple months, not a single positive on anybody who was living in that environment. And incidentally, not because of some advanced science, but because of tried and true protocols that they used in the 1918 flu. You quarantine people going in, then people wore face coverings of some form, washed their hands a lot, and remained physically distant. The big exception, of course, that when it comes to sports, or certain contact sports in particular, is that, and it's a huge exception, there's those periods of time when the masks come off, and you're literally breathing each other's air when you're, face to face with somebody on a basketball court. So that certainly made us nervous. We knew we would, through the daily testing, quickly catch someone who was infected. And then the hope was then, and honestly, our experts predicted we would get some cases. And the reason, just so it's clear, is that, again, where the bubble becomes misleading, there were a lot of Disney workers who were moving on and off our campus every day. Imagine, this is a big, hundreds of acres. And so thousands of people were working on this campus, many of whom, for union reasons at Disney, political reasons in Florida, were not being tested on a daily basis. Now, they remained physically distant. They wore both face masks, plastic shields for food servers and things like that. But we were introducing risk, no question, into the equation. So I think we thought that we might pick up a positive case, but because of the daily testing, if you quickly isolated that person, put them in, separated them, got them obviously medical treatment if they needed it, we would be okay. So, I think in retrospect, it worked better than we thought. Of course, now it's even more daunting because the players, I think, enormous sacrifice on one hand, but the players understood that in the context of what was going on in the country, depending on what numbers you use, maybe 25% unemployment, obviously major hardship in terms of COVID impacts on people's health and their, ability to work and family relations, and everyone living sort of in their own equivalent of a bubble, that on a relative basis, their sacrifice wasn't nearly what a lot of others was. But still, especially for players and as a parent of young children, I think what was most difficult was those who were being separated from their kids. And it's just hard to explain those kids. And I mean, just take the Lakers and the Heat, the teams that went to the finals, spent over 3 months on that campus. Now, there was an opportunity at the end to bring some family members down, but again, kids, some families made a decision for kids that wasn't the best place to have them there on that campus and stuff like that. So huge sacrifice for a lot of people, but we also determined that, and we hope this is the case, that was a once in a lifetime event. that we couldn't play a full season in that type of environment. So here we are now, as we're planning going into next season. Most people probably who follow the NBA have heard that our intention is to open Christmas week and to be back in arenas, most likely without fans. At least initially, a lot of that will depend on the conditions in various cities and whether we can come up with protocols that may include testing of those fans who choose to come into arenas. But so that's what we're in the middle of right now, trying, again, and with a realization too, with our players, I think on a relative basis, I still feel that what we'll be doing in terms of our protocols are safer than sort of living the lives they otherwise are, unless obviously someone chooses to completely live in a shelter and home existence. But that also means if you have kids, they can't go out either. So I think on a relative basis, where we are, whatever we do will be safer than the alternative, but riskier obviously than being in a bubble. You guys, if I'm too long-winded, just cut me off halfway through. I
No,
know
that was.
you want to get to other things.
No, this is what, I think a majority of us are here to hear about, because obviously that whole experience, I think all of us, we were holding our collective breath to see how this thing would play out, and for the NBA and the WNBA to pull it out the way they did, and for zero transmission, zero cases. I mean, it's remarkable. So we obviously, I want to hear how you were able to pull that off.
Great.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump a little bit to something that's similar, but kind of in a different vein, going along with all of the things that have been going on in 2020 and before that. So we talk a lot about leadership here at Duke, and obviously we're excited to hear your perspective on leadership. And so particularly you've talked about the murder of George Floyd as a turning point for the US, but also for the league, especially heading into the bubble. So this is a really broad question for you, but could you talk a little bit about some of the insight that you shared with the team around you, and then kind of those in your circle as well, leading the NBA during the Black Lives Matter movement?
Sure. So when we were planning, to Josh's question, when we were planning what turned out to be the restart of the season and deciding whether it was appropriate to play in a bubble. And again, I could spend a lot of time on each question, because in that moment, even before George Floyd was killed, there was many players were questioning whether we should be doing this, whether it was even the right thing in terms of the resources to be playing basketball in the middle of a pandemic, whether, again, all of us, whether we should be taking tests, et cetera. I mean, I think ultimately we decided that it was the right thing even for the country, one, that to demonstrate to people you could work through a pandemic, that there could be a certain element of normalcy, despite what was happening around us. But as those discussions were ongoing, then came George Floyd's death. And so that then became a huge additional factor in the players and the league's consideration, again, about whether this was the right thing to do in that moment. And we all went back and forth on it. I think many players, and I'm sure lots of people as part of this discussion will remember, former Dookie Kyrie Irving, had taken the position that we shouldn't be playing. And, again, everybody was welcome to their view. And, he ended up having a few discussions with him and with the Players Association about that. And I think his point was that this will divert attention, from the Black Lives Matter movement and from social justice issues. I think at the same time, there are many other players who recognize that the platform that would be afforded to them if we were playing WNBA and NBA on our campuses might be much greater than any individual player's ability to attract media attention or social media attention, for that matter. So again, we ultimately decided, of course, that we should go forward. But then the question became, if we really mean what we're saying, how will we focus attention on racial injustice, for example, as we begin playing basketball. And I think that's what led to the Players Association suggestion that for both leagues, that Black Lives Matter be literally, imprinted on the playing floor. And in addition, in both leagues, the players adopted certain social justice messages that they put on their jerseys. And I think you remember roughly 25% of the NBA is made up of players who were born outside the United States. I mean, some of them used different languages, but essentially various forms of expressions around racial equality, Black Lives Matter, social justice, et cetera. And so that became part of the restart. And again, we knew going in that for some fans, either they would actively sort of be opposed to it. I think there were others who felt that I respect it, but boy, sports should be a point of separation from what they viewed as political messages. I would say for me, again, these are close calls, and it seemed right in that moment, and it seemed consistent with the DNA of this league. It's something I've talked about before that, first of all, of course, to speak for the NBA now, it's a league that's almost 75 years old, and if you look at some of the early pioneers around this game, I think of people like Bill Russell, for example, and the fact that he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial when Dr. King delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. People don't realize that way, and obviously, I always say Bill Russell is like Babe Ruth, who's still alive. I mean, he's still around. You can talk to Bill Russell about this, and it was very controversial in 1963 when he did that. He'd won a championship with the Celtics, and then I guess it was in August of that summer, had stood on those steps. And I won't go deep into his story, but there was his home was vandalized. There were other things that happened to him as a result of him of refusing to shut up and dribble in 1963. And I was actually just watching a video earlier today from 1963 where he was saying at a press conference, "All I'm asking for is respect." It's striking that, so now, almost 60 years later, you could put a side-by-side up of a Black athlete in the NBA using almost the exact words, and maybe not even realizing that Bill Russell had given that same speech in the early 1960s. So I guess as I said, because this has always been part of our DNA, because we're a league that is comprised in both leagues of predominantly Black athletes, one of the things that we concluded is that maybe there is no institution that has a greater ability to impact how people think about these issues than these leagues. The NBA, when we began broadcasting our games again, being distributed in well over 200 countries, again, a quarter of our players from outside the United States. And these are, to me, again, these are values-based human rights issues, which of course are global in nature. And to me, it seemed right in that moment. And I've subsequently said, I don't necessarily think it's always the role league should be playing in terms of putting messages on its playing floor, only because I also recognize the other side of it, who people are saying, it's great, I would never tell players shut up and dribble, whatever else, but they have social media, they have press conferences, they have all kinds of opportunities to talk about what's important to them. I'm just not necessarily, I'm not sure it should be on the playing floor. And again, I see it as very contextual. It seemed the absolute right thing to do under those circumstances. And then just to finish off there, that messaging sort of morphed more into a social engagement message. To me, sort of the next step from protest was the players encouraging political activism in the form of voting. And I think that came directly from conversations many of our players had had with President Obama and other political leaders, social justice leaders. And there was recognition that young people in particular, listen to them And to the extent that our players, many of whom acknowledged that even though they had been eligible to vote, we have players up until their, mid 30s or so in age. Many players acknowledged they had never registered and voted before, but the Players Association put together a program with the players to make sure that players, obviously the American players, were registered and were going to vote. And then the shooting shirts added the vote message on them. And my sense is it had a real impact in terms of encouraging people, and giving people an outlet, that if you care and you want to have an impact, and it wasn't just about the presidential election, whether it was for, your city sheriff or your city council people or whatever else, get involved and vote.
No, that's amazing. Honestly, Adam, I think everybody was kind of on the fence of what messages need to be placed, for the NBA and the WNBA. And I was all for, I love the idea of having the names or the messages on the back of the jerseys and Black Lives Matter on the floor. But I'd like to ask you a follow-up question to that. Like you said, obviously what's done on the floor, you can have, messages on the back of your jersey. You can have that Black Lives Matter huge on the middle of the playing floor. Have you had conversations with, players, owners, coaches, whoever in the league for the NBA and WNBA as to how can you continue to convey the Black Lives Matter message outside or off of the playing court?
I have, and in fact, two initiatives came about as a result of, I'd say again, initial protest and activism. And there were conversations we had directly with players and team owners about what can we do beyond messages on, words. What else can we do? And so we stood up two new initiatives in the league. One was a foundation that we launched right in the middle of the summer, and the NBA team owners agreed, quite incredibly, to initially fund it with a commitment of $300 million. And so it's a 501c3 NBA foundation that the league had never had before. We have, NBA Cares and lots of great programs working communities, but we'd never had a standalone foundation. And so we agreed that it would be initially funded by the NBA team owners, and the commitment was to Black economic opportunities in the United States. And the reason initially with that narrow focus, we said, where can we have the greatest impact? And I think about who our team owners are, frankly, a group of, in many cases, some of the top entrepreneurs in the world, obviously by definition, extraordinarily wealthy people who employ lots of people. And we thought not only through this foundation and putting sort of their money out there in terms of creating jobs programs, training programs, programs to advance people to, and again, narrowly focused on Black Americans, but also, to me, taking those commitments and then more broadly into their own businesses, and many of them are incredibly expansive in terms of the scope of the businesses they're involved in. And again, and the agreement was both team owners and players would serve on the board, together with Michelle Roberts, who runs the Players Association. And in fact, we've already had our first meeting. The initial funding is coming in. And so we began there. Then after the shooting in Kenosha in the middle of the summer, at the point when we stopped playing temporarily, there was a discussion with the players and the team owners about what else can we be doing? And the thought was not to take anything away from what we can do directly in economic empowerment, but that we institutionally need to have more of a say on what become more, call it legislative issues, policy issues. And so we then created something that we're calling the National Basketball Social Justice Initiative. Again, a board comprised of NBA players, union executives, league executives, and team owners. And here we thought, all right, let's now having this separate institute, we thought, gives us an opportunity to look at issues like police reform, for example. And I think we all agreed with the players that there was a recognition that these are highly complicated issues. They become easily politicized, but there's real reform across the board. I mean, even if you look at, there's Senate Republican bills, House Democratic bills, there is more commonality than people think. These are not anti-police movements. I mean, there are people on, on the extremes, there's no question about it. But the view was that there is real common ground here, and that the NBA as an institution, again, one of the reasons we started with economic empowerment, because it was my belief, here's something that we can directly have an impact on. We can control private sector jobs. And I had this discussion with our players. When it comes to legislative changes, you guys have certain credibility, star appeal, our owners have resources, influence, but this is hard work, changing the law. And when I said to the players there, and really to our whole collective, this is not just about us talking to ourselves. This is not people who are all like-minded, seemingly all agreeing that this is what we should do. This means crossing the aisle and trying to persuade people who may not agree with you that these are needed changes, or frankly, compromising with people to say, all right, it may not be everything initially that we think we should do, but there is some common ground. So I'd say, Josh, just the second part to answer your question is, so that second sort of new initiative, so together with the foundation, to us is our ability to try to impact lasting change. So it's not just, all right, Black Lives Matter on the floor, next issue. We wanted to make sure that this was something that was long-term, that we'd have a permanent impact on. And I think that's where that $300 million of funding really comes into. And it was viewed incidentally. I mean, I understand this is not a public forum. I mean, the notion there was, let's seed it with $300 million, but let's try to raise $1 billion. I mean, let's go big. And we think there's a lot of corporations who do partner with the NBA, who have foundations of their own, who are also looking for opportunities, but frankly may not be sure who to trust and where to go. And we think because we're such a trusted brand and have so much credibility in this area, there is an opportunity for us to partner with other companies and raise other money around this. Really, again, focused on economic empowerment. I mean, as I've studied it more and more, so much of this movement comes down to ensuring that people have jobs and well-paying jobs and opportunities. I mean, lots of other stuff needs to be focused on as well, but I think there's a real opportunity for the league there.
That's great. Thanks, Adam. So I know we're getting close to time, but I am going to ask you one more tough question right at the end. And this is kind of two parts. So this has been an amazing conversation. And on a little bit more of a personal note, you've talked about some of these uncomfortable conversations that you've had with colleagues over the past few months as the leader of the NBA. So how do you reckon with your own identity and position as you lead a league with an overwhelming majority of players who are people of color, and as you also hold the WNBA under your purview, which many people might not know, but how do you kind of reckon with those identities?
Well, I'd say, Jenna, that, one thing I realized sort of, again, after George Floyd's killing, there was a lot of pent up frustration, even within my own organization. By that, I don't mean the teams, I mean league employees. And it's a pretty diverse group. I'm proud of that. WNBA as well. But, at the end of the day, you're right to point out that, vast majority of the players are Black, vast majority of the team owners are white. And that's where we are in society right now. And the question becomes, I think not just about that racial distinction, but in what ways then is that manifest in how the league operates, how sensitive we are to particular issues. I will say, as in my my senior group around me at the NBA and as the WNBA you mentioned, that I see enormous benefits selfishly to me that comes from that diversity. in terms of decision making, in terms of having, it's inclusion too. Those people are at the table and helping me think through issues. But I think what I found in particularly among some of the Black employees at the league, that there were certain things that just weren't talked about. And I know I don't have a really great answer to your question other than to say that it has to begin with talking and listening. And I think one of the mistakes I may have made, over the years was thinking that if you don't have an answer, you shouldn't engage in the conversation. And so the difficult answer being, I can't answer the question right now to say how I can change the makeup of our ownership. I'm hugely proud that Michael Jordan is an owner in this league. We have an Indian American owner born in Mumbai, a person of color, but, and a bunch of former players who have smaller interests in teams, by the way, including Grant Hill at the Atlanta Hawks. But I don't have an answer like to say, and here's the program that's going to change that. But what I've learned is we have to have the discussion. We have to talk to people about how they feel about it. We have to talk to players about that. And then even within the league office, I think there was a sense that a lot of people were parking their identity when they came to work. And when we had a lot of facilitated conversations, I know they took place at Duke, they took, among administrators there, Mary Pat and Gary, were right in the center of many of these discussions at Duke, and people at their own companies that, a lot of my colleagues, people, I've been at the league for 28 years, people I've known for, decades, who had incidents in their lives, in the serious part of your sort of rapid fire questions in the beginning, where, when you hear how they were humbled, you're like, oh my God, and that's where I can't pretend I can put myself exactly in their shoes, but I certainly can listen to them and engage with them. And it's a form of respect, back to that word too, to actually listen. And I think, there was a whole process that went on with our teams as well, because I think even a lot of the team owners privately said to me, I know I should be talking to my players about these issues, but I'm a little bit nervous about having those discussions, because what am I going to say? My response to them was, look, it's not easy. I'm learning myself, but don't go into those conversations thinking there's anything you have to say. Just listen and be authentic and react to what people are telling you. And maybe from that process, answers will emerge. And I believe that. And I've seen, it's even the foundation and the social justice initiative, if you had asked me, 3 months or a month before we shut down for the pandemic, or certainly before George Floyd was killed, I could not have said, yes, that was on my list of things that I was trying to get done in 2020. So opportunities emerge. And here, I think a lot has come from the engagement. And I think for a lot of our players too, who I think didn't think they really had a seat at the table. And I think part of even what happened in the bubble and those players coming together in that unique way, I think as it turned out, they did have enormous impact by virtue of being together in Orlando in a pandemic. I think they did have enormous impact on turning out the vote, particularly of young people, because they kind of made voting cool. I don't know what else to say. It's like they were like, yeah, this is an important thing to do. And I think I'm hopeful that what will continue to come out of this process. In fact, earlier today, we did something at the NBA. We call them our town halls, but it's, league employees, team employees. There were several thousand people on a call today listening to players, listening to experts, just talk about these issues. And again, not to be on this call to say, and here are the 5 steps you should take as an NBA team. So anyway, it's a good question. It's a hard question. And I think we just have to continue to work our way through these issues, just like Duke and under President Price is doing a fantastic job, and Gary and Mary Pat just addressing them head on. I don't know how else to do it, and but a willingness and creating, an environment where also people are comfortable potentially being wrong too. I mean, that's one thing about the NBA. I get when people say to me, well, I disagree that you put Black Lives Matter on the floor. My response is like, okay, like, tell me why you feel that way. I mean, it's like, I recognize, and again, it's not necessarily because they don't believe Black Lives Matter or don't believe in the movement. They just want to say like, oh, it's a basketball game. You shouldn't be doing that. It's like, all right, here's my view. Here's yours. I'm open to the fact that there are other ways we could have done it. And I think part of it just has to be people's real, like, earnest willingness to engage with each other.
Thank you. That was great. Sounds like humility and listening are some of the major points from that. So really appreciate that thoughtful answer.
No, I agree too. I mean, I think the biggest thing that I can take away from what you were just saying, Adam, is just the ability to be able to have conversations. Not all of us have the answers, but to be able to come together and talk with one another and be able to have those discussions on why we disagree or why we do agree. I think that's the biggest thing. So I know we're coming up on time. So again, Adam, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd also like to say thank you to the Office of Undergraduate Education, Student Affairs, GPSC, Alumni Affairs, Athletics, and Commissioner Silver's NBA support staff, and for all their time and effort in making this great event happen. Also would like a major shout out to the cross-functional Duke student government team led by Meghna Mahadeva that worked so hard on putting this event together and marketing it. Thank you guys again for everything.
Yeah, and I'll just say, Josh and Jenna, you guys are great at this. Jenna, if the med school stuff doesn't work out that well, you've got a whole nother career. And Josh, I know you're getting into the agent business, but you'll do great on television if that doesn't work out.
But keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So great to talk to you.
You too. Thank you.
All right, y'all, that's a wrap. So please be sure to look out for future Common Hour events once per semester and fill out the survey, which will open on your computer after this. Thank you for joining us via Zoom and being part of this conversation. Have a great evening.